Before we begin, a quick note. This episode of the History of Egypt podcast is brought to you ad-free thanks to my supporters on Patreon. Stick around at the end of the episode to learn more. Thank you. Across the millennia of Egyptian history, there are many trends and changes. Dynasties rise and fall, waxing and waning with their political fortunes. Artistic styles and architecture evolve over time. Pyramids rise, only to fall out of fashion and disappear. Technology changes, as advances in science allow new developments and practices in building and organization. These are the trends of history and human society. Surprisingly, even the deities are not immune. When you look at ancient Egyptian temples or art, it may seem like their gods and goddesses are each eternal, unchanging in their aspect and power. But dig a little deeper, and you will find many trends within ancient Egyptian religion and worship. Gods rise and fall, becoming more or less prominent over centuries. New figures appear, only to vanish after a couple of generations. And sometimes, gods that once belonged exclusively to kings and queens become the favorite saviors of ordinary people. It may seem natural that a god or goddess is eternal, unchanging, but the truth is anything but. This is a subject that my guest today, Dr. Tamara Siuda, has devoted a great deal of time, energy, and research to investigating. And in 2024, Dr. Siuda published some of the results of her work in the new Complete Encyclopedia of Egyptian Deities. The book is a massive tome devoted to individual gods and goddesses, both from Egypt and the neighboring societies. It includes detailed mythologies, descriptions, and references for many of these beings, and explanations as to why they were important and how their status changed over time. The Complete Encyclopedia of Egyptian Deities is available now, and I will include links in the episode description. In the meantime, allow me to introduce Dr. Tamara Siuda, who's going to introduce some of the Egyptian gods. Good morning, Dr. Siuda. Tamara, welcome to the History of Egypt podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
You are speaking to us from Oregon in the United States, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yep, and how are things up there?
Currently, it has decided not to be ridiculously hot, and I will enjoy that for a few days with our false fall until it goes back to being hot again.
Very good. We've had the same thing here in New Zealand with a false spring, and now it's turned back into cold, wet winter again, but hopefully we'll get through. So, Dr. Siuda, for those not familiar with your previous work, you're here to discuss your new book, which is the Encyclopedia of Ancient Egyptian Deities. You've been working in Egyptology for a number of years. So for those unfamiliar with your previous work, do you mind just giving us an introduction to your background, how you came into Egyptology, your PhD and research so far?
Sure. I started being interested in Egypt at an early age. I originally did my bachelor's degree in writing and rhetoric. I went into the media. During that early period after my first degree, I continued to take classes in Egyptology and was convinced, on my own and also from the teachers that I had, to go back to school and to get my master's degree in Egyptology from the University of Chicago. My doctoral advisor that I was going to have at the time was Dr. Mark Lehner, and he had the amazing blessing to discover a pyramid workman's village. Mm-hmm. And so he stopped teaching and went to go do a dig for the rest of his life. So my Egyptology degree was stalled. I waited for his replacement to come, was not able to continue at Chicago. I got sidetracked in a way, but also not in a way. During my Egyptology degree, I had become very interested in the Coptic language and in Coptic studies, which is the later form of what's going on in Egypt after the Pharaonic period. I was one of the first people to take the online degree that was offered at Macquarie University from Sydney, and I graduated with a second master's degree in Coptic studies in 2008 from Macquarie. Mm-hmm. And then I had another, a second stall. This is long. My PhD journey actually took me 20 years. Mm-hmm. after the second stall and 2 different changes of doctoral advisor, I ended up at Claremont Graduate University in California. I did my degree with Gaudat Gabra, who is a native Egyptian who was also an Egyptologist and a Coptologist. He convinced me to shift from what I had been doing. My Coptic master's degree was in Coptic music, and he convinced me to actually switch to working in Coptic martyrology, which permitted me to join that with my Egyptology interests. And so my dissertation is a study of Coptic martyrology, so that's like stories and honoring of the dead. And a good portion of my dissertation involves how in the Coptic culture that is a continuation of the pharaonic honoring of the ancestors. So it's essentially the blessed dead being honored in a different way. I talk about both. In terms of my Egyptology degree back in Chicago, my master's thesis was on the Dynasty 25 King Pia Yankee and how he came up to Egypt and made it, make Egypt great again, which is kind of horrifying, but was also sort of true. They came in with a very strong idea of being more Egyptian than the Egyptians were at the time, and bringing in this idea, particularly religiously, where they were going to reinstate the cult of Amun. And my master thesis is actually about the temple at Jebel Barkal, which was the Nubian capital of Pia, and how it is a scale replica of Karnak.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how I came at that. I have had a lifelong interest in ancient Egyptian religion and quite a bit of study in that. And I have written some books translating some ancient texts. I wrote a few years ago, I did a book about the ancient Egyptian festival calendar. Then the most recent book that I did was a considerable expansion of a little tiny booklet that I had done for a class that I taught in 1991, which in that little booklet was only 14 gods. And the encyclopedia that you mentioned that just came out in April has approximately 150. So it is much more
exponential increase. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so essentially you've had a very long-term interest in the veneration of figures, whether they are symbolic figures or whether they are tangible figures in the sense of ancestors of populations, or the concept of martyrdom and what that represents for a community and for a religious group. So would it be fair to say that you've had one of your long-term interests has been the concept of sort of veneration and memorialization of beings?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is a big personal interest, and particularly of the dead, but of the gods.
Well, that brings me sort of to the first aspect I would like to discuss with you about the new encyclopedia, is that because it has 150 deities in it, we can't go through every single one, but we can at least talk about broad trends, especially with some of the sort of rising and falling of particular religious cults or institutions over time. One of the first things I would like to sort of get your insight in is the earlier appearances of these divine beings, and whether it takes the form of inscriptions like rock carvings, textual references, or artifacts, like totem poles or votive figurines. From your studies into these deity figures, which beings sort of leap out to you as some of the earliest and most visible in the archaic, if you will, phases of Egyptian material culture?
We have evidence of divine beings dating back before any kind of writing. We have them in artistic representations. We have them in material culture finds at very early sites. And when I say very early, I mean very early. Nabta Playa is a site that I believe is classified as Neolithic, so it's not even, generally that would not even be considered ancient Egypt. However, some years ago, I was in contact with one of the archaeologists who was working on that site, and he said, I understand that you know a lot about ancient Egyptian religion. Did they worship bulls? And he had no knowledge of this. And of course, yeah, exactly. You chuckle because of, oh, yes, they did. And so he was very surprised to hear that there was a connection to that. He had previously assumed that it was just kind of related to these ideas of like stone circles and really, really old cultural things. But I was able to talk to him about some of the early bovine cults that happened in Egypt, and photographs that they sent me of things that they found at the site very clearly line up with what we see in the pre-dynastic period and in right before hieroglyphs. Images of people dancing in front of either actual bovine skulls or images of these very large horned bulls and cows. Cows also have horns. And at the same time, they also found imagery of a pair of hawks, a male hawk and a female hawk. Well, again, this is something that we see rather frequently throughout pharaonic religion. And these seem, I mean, obviously I'm not an expert in Neolithic anything, but these seem to me, at least in the context of Egypt and the Nile Valley, that these are predecessors to the Horus and the Hathor cults and the cults that we see throughout of celestial and cosmic hawks or falcons or other kinds of birds and bulls and cows. Definitely. There are connections. So it goes back quite early. Later than that, in Egypt and in Nubia, we have ceramics that have images of people dancing in front of temporary shrines that are built out of grass or wood or things that wouldn't have been permanent. Later on, we have stone versions of those exact same designs that are being reproduced, especially in the Old Kingdom. For example, at Saqqara, in the sort of model village that Djoser built around his pyramid, there are images of the exact same shapes and dimensions of the buildings that appear in these very early paintings or pottery that doesn't have any kind of wording on it. So we see this throughout. We see sometimes on the tops of these buildings there are standards, which divine standards that happen later on. I mean, there's a whole line of them on the Narmer palette, people walking the standards of the gods, and that is something that continues to be done up until the late period. There are Greco-Roman images of divine standards, which are essentially like L-shaped poles with images of the deities on top. So this is 4,000, 5,000 years of the continuing of that symbol. And some of the gods that appear on these really early symbols in the standards are Neith and Hathor and Horus and the god Min. And Set doesn't appear as in the anthropomorphic form or the blended form that we see him in later on, but we do see his animal in some of these images, and particularly I want to say that there's one on the Narmer palette. If it's not the Narmer palette, it's one of those other palettes. But the image of the composite animal with the forked tail and the square ears. We see quite a bit of these things early. It's also, you have to be careful if there's no writing to not automatically presume that, for example, every single crocodile is an image of Sobek. It might not be. But if it's being shown in a shrine, if it's being shown with people dancing around it or bowing to it or giving it things, then that's more likely not to be just an image of an animal, but of a theophany of a divine being.
Very good. And over time, certain deities come to the fore, or at least archaeologically, they're more visible at certain periods than at others. Having gone through so many deities and sort of had to catalog the sources for them and their appearances, their worship, the texts that deal with them in more or less detail. Let's start with the Old Kingdom and the early dynastic period. In that first 1,000 years or so of the written and the visual record that we can really study, which are the deities that come to the fore most prominently, and are there any sort of trends or bell curves over that period?
So trending kind of patterns along with what's happening in the country itself or in the countries themselves, because at the beginning of that period, it's a number of little, what I think is city-states. I mean, that's Obviously, states don't come along until later, but it's this idea that there are these small regions or cities and their surrounding areas. They have their own gods. Essentially, they have their own religion. So we're not really talking about ancient Egyptian religion, but religions in plural.
Mm-hmm.
And each of these little regions, as the country begins to unify, depending on which cities rise or fall, depending on where the various people who win the wars come from, some cities become more important than others. Some cities take over other cities. Gods get spread around as people travel between the cities. And this is very, in the pre-dynastic and the early dynastic period, this seems to be, at least from what we have of the record there, written and unwritten, it's very fluid. It's not, you can't say that there's any one deity of that time period, or even once the lands are unified, there's not like a single god or a single group of gods that's on top. You continue to see all of the deities that were in the prehistoric period, and then you start to see some other ones who are the bigger gods of the regions that are flourishing in this period. This is the time when we start to see not just Horus, but also Horus and Set sort of set together.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. This is the period in which the solar god Ra becomes much more prominent, and then from the Old Kingdom that absolutely takes off. But in this period, he's just sort of there and becoming more known. There are some older deities who are the gods of their areas that are more prominent then than they will be later. For example, Winnig in the Abydos area, who ends up losing his job to Osiris eventually, and then eventually becomes part of Osiris, at least in terms of mythology. Sobek, who waxes and wanes throughout. We'll see him again when we talk about the Middle Kingdom. Min, Wepwed, and Khentiamentiu, and also then later on there's another jackal god, Anubis, who pops up after Dynasty 5, and Anubis and the other two jackal gods. There's some sort of negotiation that happens with Osiris, who also does not appear before Dynasty 5. And after that's over with, Khentiamentiu has become nothing but a title and been fused completely with Osiris. Wepwed is sort of set aside as just a regional deity, and then Anubis joins the family of Osiris and becomes much more popular. In the region of Thebes, which much later on is super Amun-oriented, Amantu is the primary god at that time. We have a whole god there. Amun's there, but he's not quite as important. And in the region of Memphis, where Ptah will become the big god, back in the early dynastic period, this is Tatenin and this is Sokar. Have more of an influence there at that time. Should I just jump into the Old Kingdom because they are kind of connected?
Old Kingdom, sure, yeah. So
that period that everything's sort of in flux calms down somewhat with the unification of the two lands, and then we move into what we're calling the Old Kingdom. Mm-hmm. This sees the rise of the royal house, and as a result, kingship deities associated with kingship, deities associated with order, are immediately thrust to the forefront, and particularly here, the cult of Ra is where that explodes, because the families who are kings are favoring that deity, and so they start building solar temples to him, which is a new development, a different kind of temple, a permanent temple made in stone. Mm-hmm. This is the period when the pyramids are being built. This is a very significant sort of defining of what Egypt is. And so a bunch of gods at this point start to become much more national in origin. And then we also have a bunch of new gods show up. So the gods that become more prominent, who had already existed but become more prominent, are Amun and Khonsu and Thoth or Jehudi. Ptah becomes the primary deity of the Memphite region in that time. And then his center at Memphis is very important throughout the rest of the Egyptian history. We have some new gods show up, including Osiris, who I mentioned, and then, of course, the members of his family, Isis and Nephthys. Horus, of course, existed previous to that, but after Osiris becomes important, then there's a discussion of a younger Horus, one who is the child of Osiris, one who has a role as the king who takes the place of Osiris when Osiris dies. Sekhmet also appears in Dynasty 5 as the wrathful manifestation of the goddess Hathor, who we knew previous to this. Mm-hmm.
Bing bong, Dominic from the future here. Dr. Siuda just mentioned the goddess Sekhmet, the angry manifestation of Hathor. If you are interested in the mythology around these two goddesses, you can find that in the Book of the Sky Cow, which we released as episode 201. Back to the interview.
There are some people who like to tie Sekhmet's appearance to the First Intermediate Period and say that that myth was a reflection of the upheaval in the country at that time. I think that's probably wishful thinking. I expect that she existed before that, and we just don't have evidence. It's hard to know what's going on in some of the period of the early Old Kingdom and the late part of the pre-dynastic, just because we just don't have so much evidence. Also related to that, I don't think I mentioned in the early part, the goddess Bast, who is important, Bast or Bastet. We know her from Dynasty 2. So she shows up after unification, but is still quite early.
Mm-hmm. So that's the sort of broad trend in the early and the Old Kingdom. I won't ask you to go the same detail for the later periods because, that would take another half an hour, which is fine.
Right. This is a gigantic subject. We could do this for years.
But, if we sort of think of things at the end of the Old Kingdom and the First Intermediate Period, we have deities like Ra, Osiris, and Horus, who are the big royal ones who are really front and center. Mm-hmm. As the Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom come through, we have other deities like Amun coming to the forefront based on political and other factors. Broadly speaking, what is your understanding, based on your research, of these national gods in particular and the trends we see in their rising and falling? Do you view it as a political phenomenon? Amun rises in accordance with the Theban rise, or do you see it more as religious trends that are bubbling below the surface, which get picked up by the royal household? Do you see it as a top-down or a bottom-up kind of process?
I think it's a combination of both, and it's also different depending on the deity and the time period. Mm-hmm. Amun's rise does feel more political because in the Middle Kingdom, that area is much more Montu-oriented, and then suddenly it shifts when the ruling family shifts, and it never goes back. There's a small period where then they move the capital and they have a family of kings who are all named for Sobek, and it's in the Fayum, and so then Sobek becomes popular. But Amun is still popular, and as soon as that family's out of the way, they go right back to the Amun. So I feel like that part is definitely got some political business going on, simply because that's the center of the country at that time. It's where all of the things are happening in terms of the continued decisions about who will rule the country, and dealing with various incursions of people from outside. Previously, in the Old Kingdom, with the rise of the Ra cult and the solar cult, while that started by the royal house, I feel like that has more influence across the religion as a whole, because that also doesn't go away. And there is then, first of all, there's like regional situation between the Ra cult, which is in the north, and the Amun cult, which is in the south. Which one's more important? Which one has to do whatever? At some point in the transition between the Middle Kingdom and the Second Intermediate Period, they start talking about Amun and Ra as being the same deity. Mm-hmm. Syncretize them. They put them together as Amun Ra, and that syncretism is probably politically motivated, because then it make sure that the North is not going to secede from the South, or vice versa. But it also speaks to a larger country that is recognizing that they have two deities that are essentially doing the same things in terms of the religion. They're both solar deities. They're both kingship deities. They're both very well beloved by many people. And so it makes sort of sense for them to have this syncretism. And then from there, the Amun-Ra cult absolutely becomes, pretty much for the rest of Egyptian history, the primary cult of royalty and of the government, with the exception of the Dynasty 18 hard stop, where Amun-Ra worship is completely stopped in favor of a cult of personality by one king, which then collapses as soon as that king's gone, because it was based on him, and therefore without him it couldn't thrive. That's also difficult to discuss in any sort of definitive term, because the evidence that we have, obviously a lot of it is coming from the people who made these decisions. So we can't necessarily say that the ordinary person on the street had the same beliefs about both of those deities or other deities as the king did, because we're looking at royal documents.
Okay. Well, let me then ask you about these sort of later periods, the literal late period and the Greco-Roman era, because those are so much better documented in terms of the non-royal levels of society. Leaving aside the big national gods, Amun, Ra, and them, during the later period, the Greek and Roman as well, which are the deities that are most visible in the archaeological record as the sort of the people's deities, if you will, the ones that are most important to the average Egyptian during this later phase?
Right. In the late period in particular, this is our rise of the cult of Osiris.
That's interesting. That's interesting, and I wanted to touch on that because in the earlier phase, he does seem like a very royal level deity.
Yes.
And then it almost sort of, pardon the phrase, trickles down and becomes extremely popular in the lower level. So if you're able to just sort of walk us through how that happens briefly.
I would actually say that happens in the late Ramesside period, that it happens before this. There is a period of, after Ramses III, and maybe starting with Ramses III, we know that he was assassinated. We know that there was tremendous amounts of turmoil during his reign. This is the time period where there are famines and there are strikes and there are incursions of warfare and various people marauding and all kinds of stuff going on. At the same time that that's happening, there also seems to be a development in the religion's practice where individual people are more important. They're more visible. We're seeing them more frequently. They are writing down. We also, at the same time, so this may not entirely be related to what's going on, but at that same time, we also have a rise in literacy. Not just important governmental people or scribes or soldiers who are keeping track of the army as scribes are writing anymore. You have individuals who, you have nobles and in some cases, less important people who learned to write when they were in the army or whatever. But they've learned to write. And so they start to put things in their tombs, like prayers to various deities. So now we have an insight into what ordinary people were saying in their prayers and who they were talking to. They're always talking to a various group of household gods that always appear in material culture as well. Goddesses like Taweret, who's protecting pregnant women and children, Bes, who is protecting the household and anybody in it and scaring away nightmares and evil spirits. And then the gods of one's town or the gods of one's profession start to get recognized. And then you also have this sort of phenomenon where people will start talking about my God. They personalized it. It's not just the god of my town or the god of my job. This is now a deity in which I have a personal and intimate relationship with this deity, and I can go to them when I'm in trouble, and I can help. There are some really lovely prayers from the artisans at Deir el-Medina to the god Ptah, who hears prayers. They literally call him that. And also to the goddess Merit Seger, who is believed to live in the mountain that shines above where they all live. So they see her every day, and they're convinced that she punishes them when they're not good. And so there are a lot of prayers where they're asking her to be nice to them. Please don't send a sandstorm today. We have hot work to do. Thank you for saving my uncle from blindness, or from making sure that my child didn't die when they fell in a hole. This is this sort of thing we haven't seen before in any kind of detail. And then suddenly it springs up, and that continues throughout the late period and into the Hellenistic period. And that's when I'm saying when we have this rise of savior gods, and particularly Osiris, because Osiris shifts roles. When he's first introduced in the pyramid text, he's very frightening. He is the god of the dead, and he threatens to send the dead to hurt people if they don't do what he wants. And a lot of the imagery in the pyramid text is fearful. That don't want Osiris's attention. You want him to punish the wicked and leave you alone. Later on, he acquires an entire mythological cycle around the idea that he's been murdered, and that he is not resurrected, but that he is empowered in the other life to watch over the dead and also the living. And then he also acquires an idea of being sort of representative of the cyclical and eternal nature of life, that things can die, but they also come back. And in this, he becomes a savior deity who can be appealed to for a good death, who can be appealed to for a good afterlife, who can be appealed to. He gets associated with grain and the growth of the grass and the growth of animals and just life in general. And in particular, being paired with his wife Isis, who doesn't exist before Dynasty 5, as far as we can tell anywhere, but is a manifestation of life itself. So the two of them become very personal deities for people, related to all kinds of spheres of life, health, and also everything associated with death and funerals. And they become very, very popular outside of that royal big context.
And speaking of Isis, in your research, have you been able to devote much time to the Isis cults that develop outside of Egypt during, especially the Roman period? Have you had a chance to dig deep into those very much?
It's not an area of my specialty, but I have looked into it simply out of personal interest, and then also peripherally, according to some other things that I've studied.
Does Isis take on a different form in those outside cults, or is it very much the same goddess just transposed, or do they remix her, if you will, for their own context?
The answer to that is yes. All of those things are true.
All of them. Okay.
She's very. There are places where you can say that she's taken on roles of other Egyptian deities, notably Hathor, also Renunutet, also Shai, the goddess, or not always a goddess, but the deity of destiny. She also picks up Hellenistic associations. She gets associated with Demeter. She gets associated with Aphrodite sometimes. In Rome, they equate her with Magna Mater and with Fortuna, and she acquires much more of a kind of a matronly conception. In Egypt, she is a goddess who is a mother, but she is not necessarily a mother goddess until the late period. And that seems to be very heavily influenced by the other non-Egyptian mother deities that she gets associated with. But then that carries her everywhere. She goes everywhere in the Roman Empire. Her image is everywhere. It's absolutely ubiquitous. And then that jumps again and starts to inform Christian iconography. When they are looking for the images of the Mother of God, they look right at Isis, who was called Mother of God almost from the beginning, thousands of years previous.
So we have national deities like Amun, Ra, Atum, Ptah, and we also have deities that commune more strongly with the individuals: Osiris, Meret Siger, Aset or Isis, and deities of the home. These are all Egyptian gods, but as Dr. Siuda notes in her Encyclopedia of Egyptian Deities, many of the gods we meet in Egypt, especially from the New Kingdom and later, are actually visitors or guests to the Nile Valley. They come from outside lands and cultures, and when the Egyptians meet them, they bring them home to incorporate in the pantheon. Now, Dr. Siuda introduces and explains some of these foreign deities.
Taking it back to the Pharaonic period, I would like to briefly touch on the sort of the guest deities, as you term them, who enter Egypt from the surrounding lands, west, east, south, and elsewhere. You mentioned Bes beforehand, who for some scholars might be one of these imported deities, although I understand there's some ambiguity about his exact origins.
Yes.
But maybe particularly let's focus primarily on the New Kingdom, because that's where the podcast history is currently sitting. So that's the part listeners will be most familiar with. Say around Dynasty 18 and 19, who are the most prominent guest or foreign deities, if you will, who come in and become visible within the Egyptian context?
In that period, I think they're predominantly coming out of the Levant. The Canaanite deities, Baal, Reshep, Anat, Astarte, Kadesh comes in towards the end of that period and then continues for a bit.
Not to be confused with the city, just if anyone's listening. Kadesh the city and Kadesh the deity, two different things.
I think in her own city, Kadesh is how she ends up being called in Egyptian, but I think her own city, where she comes from, I believe that they call her Kudushu.
Kudushu. That sounds good.
Something like that. It's Ugaritic, but Kadesh is how it ends up written in
the Battle of Kudushu doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it?
No, it doesn't. But so the deities in that period are coming in through that empire. They're coming in either with the mercenaries who are working for the Ramesside kings, or they're coming in as a result of prisoners of war, or they're coming in as a result of the increased amount of trade and kind of back and forth culturally that's happening between Egypt and all of these client states that are in what is now Israel and Syria and Jordan and kind of up towards Turkey.
What about southern deities? This is a topic that, for better or worse, historically in Egyptology has often been terribly overlooked. Earlier you mentioned Jebel Barkal, which is a large freestanding escarpment or mountain with a very prominent outcropping, which I'll let you talk about in a moment. So I wonder if you could introduce some of the prominent, I'll call them Nubian, but I don't particularly like that umbrella term anymore. I think it's too reductive. But the prominent Nubian deities who we see appearing within this region who also come into Egypt as well. Are you able to introduce some of those and give a sense of what they're about?
So yeah, the reason that Jebel Barkal is important religiously is because of that mountain. The front of the mountain itself is roughly cylindrical, and it kind of goes straight up and down. And the front of it, the part of it that faces where the town was built, the city was built right underneath that outcropping that you mentioned. And if you look at images of this place, you will notice that that outcropping resembles the Uraeus serpent or the cobra snake that appears on ancient Egyptian crowns and is itself considered to be a manifestation of the wandering eye goddess, who in her mythology in Egypt goes to Nubia, quote unquote, every year, which is a reflection of how the sun itself goes further south until the winter solstice and then proceeds back north in the sky until the summer solstice. And so they already have this idea that this wandering goddess goes off to Nubia to do whatever she does and then has to be enticed to return. Where the fourth cataract was about as far as the Egyptians went into what is now Nubia, or what is actually now Sudan. So this image, when the Middle Kingdom Egyptians get down there and they see this mountain with this giant snake on the front of it, it strikes them as something holy and important. And it turns out that the locals also think that it's something holy and important. So eventually the Napatan Kingdom is founded at this place. And the temple of Amun is seated right in front of the snake. And at the very bottom of the snake, they cut sanctuaries into the rock beneath it, and the crowns, the royal crowns, are kept there. So they've made that exact same connection. Mm-hmm. Later on, they build other temples that resemble temples that they've seen in Egypt. They have a very heavy Egyptian influence, although they are still Nubian, and they do have their own art, and some of them have some things that are not particularly Egyptian in them, but it's recognizable. Mm-hmm. And they've taken those cults and they've done something with them. In that area, in the Napatan area, and in their culture, they predominantly are worshiping Egyptian gods. There are not as many of what we'd call the Nubian gods happening there. Mm. Where we see them and where they interact with Egypt is at the first cataract, where Philae and Aswan are, and also a little bit further south than where Napata is, in the city of Meroe. There are gods closer to there, and even further south than there, who are Nubian deities who get worshipped in Egyptian ways, where they build Egyptian temples and they seem to, use the same kind of art of giving them offerings and such, but they are definitely not Egyptian gods. You can tell by their names, you can tell by their manifestations. An example of that is the lion-headed god Apedemek, or Apedemek. Up towards the cataract, we have Dadun, or Dadwan, who ends up being equated with the million Horus gods. We have another god he gets the Greek name Arantsnoufis, which comes from Egyptian Iri Hames Nefer, which is something like who brings the good guest. And we have,
Well, there is one particular that I'd like to ask you about because, I was going to ask about Mandulus, because one of the popular things that you'll see online shared about the ancient Egyptian deities is the last hieroglyph inscription at the Temple of Philae.
Yes.
What many people don't realize is that is carved by a priest of Mandulus, who is still living, and he seems to be a family lineage of priests in this region. So I'd just like to quickly ask you about this god, because he's the subject of the very last hieroglyph inscription that has survived.
Mandulus is another deity that ends up, for the Egyptians, in their mindset as one of the Horus gods. He is a warrior god. He is associated with lions. He's associated with knives, and they usually depict him as having really big weapons. He's a hero. He is a protector. The priest of Mandulis is appearing at Philae because that is one of the last places in which Pharaonic religion survives. And it survives mostly among Nubian people because among the Egyptians, there were various laws that were passed either by Roman emperors or by Byzantine emperors that were starting to, at first they discouraged Pharaonic worship, and then eventually they outlawed it. But those laws don't apply to the Nubians. And there is it starts as an unspoken agreement, and then it is actually written into treaties that the Nubians are permitted to come north and worship Isis and her family at Philae and at the various islands in the area. They get permission to come up at certain times. And so that's why the last evidences that we have end up being from Nubians rather than from Egyptians, because they're the last people who are still being able to use those temples in a legal fashion where they're able to be there long enough to make inscriptions in the first place.
So throughout Egypt, you will find temples dedicated to gods who we might class as foreign to the Nile Valley. Many of these entered Egypt as a direct result of the empire, to the south in Nubia or Sudan, and to the north and east in Canaan and Syria. When we speak of Egyptian religion, we really are speaking of a melting pot of different traditions and customs. The boundaries between these cultures and the deities they worship are much blurrier than their political frontiers. Those traditions persisted for centuries. Surprisingly, some of them are still present in Egypt today. I asked Dr. Siuda about any descendants of the ancient Egyptian religion that you might find in the modern Nile Valley. The answers are quite remarkable.
And out of curiosity, the Islamic religion has permeated this entire region right through East Africa, all the way along the Nile. But I am curious to know whether you are aware of any anthropological studies that have looked at the persistence of any of these ancient traditions among the rural peoples of Egypt and Sudan that might be related to or connected to any of these deities. I guess what I'm getting at is how thoroughly have the monotheistic religions, starting with the Romans, swept those old traditions aside? Or to your awareness and understanding, how many of the ancient religious ideas still percolate within these communities?
This is where we get into my dissertation work.
Good. Let's go.
And I tell you that essentially when Egypt, and then also Nubia, aka Sudan and Ethiopia, when those places are first Christianized, and then later they are taken under the Arab conquest and they are largely made Muslim, although that's not as true in Ethiopia proper. And there are certain pockets of Egypt where Christians outnumber Muslims, but not very many anymore. In that process, which takes centuries, old habits die hard.
Mm-hmm.
People who have found meaning in things and are also, at least from the Egyptian cultural standpoint, very cognizant of their ancestors and wanting to stay connected with them somehow. So they perpetuate these cultural ways, and they continue. For example, this month, so in what is September generally, and I believe it may move throughout the year, but it's usually around this time of month. In the Pharaonic calendar, around this time of year, starting with the new moon, is the big festival called Opet, which is the marriage festival of Amun and Mut at Luxor, or modern-day Luxor, which was Karnak and Thebes in the past. In that tradition, for thousands of years, they have 11 days or 27 days. In the late period, it got lengthened. But this was a very long festival in which the sacred icons of these deities were put into ritual boats, and they were carried on the backs of people for almost, I want to say it's a mile. It's far. It's a long distance between the two temples. And the boats would go back and forth, and there would be parades, and there would be singing, and there would be dancing and offering, and all kinds of fun things happening. Today, hasn't stopped. After Luxor Temple was buried by sand, eventually a mosque was built on top of where it was. And no one knew that there was a temple underneath it until at some point they started to dig, and then they dug out a temple. And now if you visit the Temple of Luxor, when you go right inside the first pylon, if you look up, you will notice that there is a building up on top of the wall. And this is the mosque that had been built when, at the time, that had still all been sand. The annual celebration of the holy man who was buried in that mosque, because the mosque is also a tomb, and it's a holy site for the sheikh. He is called Abu Hagag. Every year, the people of Luxor, who are Muslim, get together and have big parades in which they take various sacred items, new cloth for the tomb of the sheikh. Sometimes they'll take out the Quran documents that are kept there, or other pictures of the saint's family. They will take them either on horseback or camelback. They will have a big parade and parade them around town. And everybody in town will gather in what is now the dugout front of the temple of Amenemhut there. So they're in the pharaonic temple, but they're looking up at the mosque, and they are performing what is Islamic ceremony in honor of that saint and the festival of the town. But what they're doing is exactly what all of their ancestors were doing. They just did it to different beings. Still the same kind of celebration. And in some cases, it is a literal parallel. In the 1960s, when Chicago House was doing excavations there, and they were employing local Egyptians to help with the work on the temple, one of my colleagues who worked there had told me that the locals had been asking about these images on the walls of Luxor Temple that show people carrying boats. And like, why are they carrying boats? And like, oh, well, because the boats had holy items in them and they took them to the temple. Well, lo and behold, suddenly the next year when they have the Sheikh al-Beled celebration, they start taking boats out of the Nile and putting their children in them and carrying them down the street. And now this is also part of the parade, where they will bring boats as parade floats and set the boats in the front of the temple. And it's literally exactly the same. You know, some years they will actually dress up like pharaonic Egyptians and put images of Amun on their boat, you know, so that it matches the image on the wall.
So the city of Luxor, ancient Waset, holds a very clear connection to the traditions of their ancestors. And the annual Mulid Abu el-Hagag, the festival of the local saint, features many parallels with the ancient celebrations. And some of these are intentional, done by the locals to draw that connection closer. I have included some videos of this celebration in the episode description if you would like to see the practices unfolding. It is a remarkable and vibrant local tradition. I hope to see it in person one day.
Actually, I would like to ask you one question that you may or may not have an answer to, but it's something that I see copy-pasted a lot on the internet. And for the life of me, I have never encountered any historical source to substantiate this, and I suspect you know what I'm going to ask you about. Did the ancient Egyptian pharaohs masturbate into the river to encourage the flood?
Years and years ago, I went looking for it myself because I thought that was a very extraordinary thing to say, and I wanted to know where it came from. It's historically ridiculous. Wouldn't be legitimate simply because of the idea of like ritual purity. And I talk about that in the Encyclopedia too. The whole discussion of so-called temple prostitution and ritual sex inside temples at all. Very unlikely throughout Egyptian history, not because anybody thinks sex is bad, but because they think that it's something that humans do. And they think that it involves bodily fluids, and bodily fluids in general are not permitted in the temple when you're on service. So it would not be a good thing.
Well, let me ask you about that, because recently I had a conversation with Courtney Marks, who had also done her postgraduate studies on this. And one of the things she looked at was the ritual masturbation of the god, God's statue, as part of the story of creation. Because, of course, Atum, or whichever deity is the subject of the tale in question, one of the ways in which all of reality is created is through an act of bodily fluid emanation. Right. How do we square that? The very tangible mythological origin and the idea of that particular bodily fluid, how do we square that with other records that suggest a sort of squeamishness on the part of bodily fluids when it comes to the priests or the priestly activities?
My understanding is that there are places for certain things. that it's never, there is never a moral judgment. That does need to be made clear. Anybody who's coming and saying that there's a prudish idea that sex is bad, or that masturbation is something embarrassing or bad, it's not, there's no evidence for that in antiquity at all.
The gods are happily having sex all the time.
Gods are doing this, and as you said, you have a creation myth where that's where everything literally comes from, pun intended. So that can't be a bad thing. But a temple is a symbolic place. It's not just a sacred building, but it is also a representation of the time before time. And so there's this idea that in order for it to remain that sacred, you need to remove yourself from the world and its bodily fluids and try to be as pristine as possible. Obviously, you're not going to be perfect at it. But so there are varying degrees of attempts to make that more possible, which gets really out of hand in like the Hellenistic period, where they become very literal about these things, and then you have people shaving their entire bodies, having no hair while they're in practice, or having to bathe 3 or 9 or 21 times before they can go in the building. You're not allowed to go into ritual service if you've eaten certain foods within a certain number of days, or you've had sex in a number of certain days, or you've had your period if you're a woman. The rules are not monolithic. They seem to change with the various cults and also with the time periods. Like, different deities are not as bothered by these things, and some. I mean, there are some images of people giving offerings and doing devotions in certain contexts in street clothing, but certain other things, like inside the sanctuary of the temple, those sorts of things would not occur. So, during the drunkenness festivals of Hathor, people are getting very drunk, and there's probably all kinds of fun stuff going on, but not inside the sanctuary. This is going to be a place that's going to be held aside to say, okay, this kind of thing doesn't happen here. There are other rooms for that. And so that's the way that you kind of look at it. The degree of, is this acceptable, is this not acceptable, is always contextual.
Sure. And one more question I'd like to ask on that, and I'll try to keep it brief because we could go down a rabbit hole here, is so many of the sources that we really have for the nitty-gritty of the ritual activity comes from that late period or later. So much of it for many scholars starts with Herodotus, and everything later is that period of description. But historically, one thing we know about the late period is that they become the common term is archaizing. They are constantly looking back to the greatness of the past. And if you'll pardon the very obvious modern parallel, one of the common features of declining societies is that as a rise in conservatism and fundamentalism, puritanism around whatever is the subject of the day, getting back to whatever the good time was. With that in mind, how much of what Herodotus tells us about ritual purity or ritual activity, how much of what we know from Greco-Roman temple texts and things, to what degree is that likely to almost be an purified version of what was actually happening before, a sort of over-fundamentalism, if you will?
I'm sure that it is. I think you're absolutely correct. That's also why, like I said in the earlier part of the conversation, I would talk about ancient Egyptian religions, plural, because I think not only are there regional religions where what's going on in this town is not necessarily the same as what's going on in that town, and not just with the deities, but even the practices. There are also significant amounts of change and emphasis and interpretation and reinterpretation going on throughout this period. And time period is also very important. To draw your modern parallel, Christianity is something that most of the people who will be listening to this podcast are relatively familiar with. There is technically really not one Christianity. There are a number of different groups that claim to be Christian that have very different traditions. They may have things in common, but they are also quite different. Also, they are operating in different time periods. Think about how much Christianity would have changed from the time of Christ to now. And that's only a third of the time period that we're looking at when we think about ancient Egyptian religions. And that's not even counting contemporary devotions to them, which are existing. There are people who are still doing it in Egypt. There are people who are still doing it all over the world. And they may or may not be accurate either. And I mean, that the idea of accuracy may just be a fallacy. It'd be like, okay, this is not, religion is a living thing and cannot be pinned down into a single. That's also kind of the beauty of a polytheism. You don't have that emphasis on it has to be the one true way, because it's not. It's never organized that way. It's always organized with an understanding that life is messy and therefore religion is also messy. But yes, in that late period, there is a very strong sort of, we're doing it right and everybody else isn't. That happens. And the Nubians do it, when they come in Dynasty 25, that's their entire reason. The rationale that they give for coming north is that they are now embarrassed by Egypt because Egypt is not keeping its promises and it's not Egyptian anymore and it's being run by terrible Libyans and we need to get rid of them and make it better again. They come at it completely from that perspective.
Excellent.
So we are faced with a difficult legacy. Many of the most detailed records and descriptions of ancient Egyptian religion come from the later period, in the first millennium BCE and under the Greeks and Romans. But, as Dr. Siuda has noted, in those periods the Egyptians, and especially their priests, are consciously looking back to better times. They are taking what they know about the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms and trying to double down on the religious traditions as they understand them. But in some cases, that can lead to an overcorrection or a sort of fundamentalism with how they approach rituals and beliefs. It is an enormously complicated subject, and we're going to spend a lot of time exploring it when we finally reach the late period. But the long and short of it is that much of our understanding about ancient Egyptian religions, as Dr. Siuda terms them, comes from those later centuries, but we're not sure how much has been skewed by a sort of fundamental conservatism. It's an interesting topic, which I look forward to covering more.
So now I would like to just ask you a couple questions more on the modern side of things, particularly the sort of conceptual, the philosophical, how we look at the ancient Egyptian deities, how we look at their religions, and how we look at these things conceptually. So one thing you discuss in the introduction to your book is the challenge for modern English-speaking Western audiences, who are presumably the primary audience for this publication. One of the big challenges for us really is divesting ourselves of the monotheistic Judeo-Christian Islamic upbringings that we've had in our communities and actually getting into the mindset of a polytheistic society. How do we break past those preconceptions and barriers to really get closer to their mindset around these things?
I would start by saying we're getting better at it, and I have seen that improvement in my own lifetime. When I was younger, even when I started my own studies, 25-ish years ago, the predominant approach was either to be very atheistic about it and just treat all of it as if it was symbolism and none of this is real. It's just weird stuff that people believe, or people were coming at it from a heavily Christian background, and thus it was very disparaging. Well, these are all false gods. These are all the gods that were replaced by later things and are therefore no longer relevant. And so, the first approach loses a whole bunch of nuance. But one of the most striking things that I can recall reading from an Egyptologist, Siegfried Morenz, wrote a lovely book that is a very simple book about the religions in general. It's now kind of outdated, but it's still a pretty good book. And in the beginning of the book, he says, when I'm studying this, I never forget for a moment that for these people, these gods were real. And I didn't get that sense from a lot of the other Egyptologists that I was reading. They had already made a value judgment that either the gods were not real or they were worthless. And so whether or not they intended for that to color their studies, it does. But Morenz had taken the step back and said, all right, regardless of what I think, regardless of the baggage or the biases that I bring to this study, which I'm going to simply because I'm human and I have opinions. They're not necessarily good or bad. They're just what I have. I have to acknowledge that what I am studying and the people I'm studying in particular had their own beliefs and they believed in them and they were real to them. And whatever I study needs to come out of that space. And so that was something that I had always kind of thought about when I did my own study. I needed to acknowledge where I was coming from and whether or not I was interpreting things according to what I thought they were or what the evidence was telling me. And it's hard to do. You have to do that as any kind of scholar, particularly a scholar of history. no matter how neutral you try to be, you're never going to be completely neutral. It's just not possible. Solving that issue is resolved simply by reminding yourself that you come to it with certain preconceptions, with certain assumptions, with certain biases, and then trying to be aware of them. It's not easy, especially with something like religion, especially if you are any kind of a religious person. If you're not an atheist, you have beliefs, and your beliefs may or may not mesh with the things that you read about ancient Egyptian religion, and that may make you uncomfortable. It may make you confused. It might make perfect sense. You never know. But you bring that to it, and you have to be aware of it. We have a tendency also, and this is a tendency of modernity. It is kind of related to the Protestant Reformation and the way that we think about superstition now, and the way that we think about beliefs that aren't based in science or fact or reason. But there's a place where it's also easy to dismiss this religion as a past practice. Well, we don't do that anymore. We don't think that way anymore. It's all cute, but it's not legitimate. But these religions, these deities, meant something on a very deep level for millions of people for no less than 4,000 years, and probably closer to 6. I don't believe, myself, and this is just me, I'm trying to be humble there. I don't think that it is appropriate for our cultures, which, the oldest of them might be a couple thousand or so, to look back at that and then say, well, that's just worthless because we don't do it anymore. It clearly was not worthless to a whole lot of people for a very long time. So there had to have been something to it. And trying to approach it at least with a respect says that, people weren't just irrational for 6,000 years, but they had a format of a religion, and they had deities that they loved very much and who were involved in their everyday lives in lots of different ways. Going back to Marins, I have to remind myself that for them, they were real. It doesn't matter what I think about them in a certain way. My opinion has to be kept separate. I have to approach it. If I want to understand their religion, then I need to try to step out of my own space and step into theirs.
My thanks to Dr. Siuda for those very well-considered and astute observations on how we can approach the ancient Egyptian religions. We all grow up with baggage, cultural, social, educational. But when we are dealing with ancient cultures, we do have to put that aside as much as possible to acknowledge the sincerity of their beliefs, their practices, and their outlook on the world. And I think Dr. Siuda's perspective on that was particularly illuminating, at least for myself. Now, we move to the output of Dr. Siuda's recent research, which is her compiling and publication of the Complete Encyclopedia of Egyptian Deities, a hefty and impressive tome that includes detailed discussions about countless beings who were important in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Dr. Siuda spent many years working on this book, and I wanted to ask her some questions about it and the deities she particularly likes.
So you've divided the book into a few sort of parts, one of which is the major deities of Egypt, whom you call the Netcheru. One is the Libyan and Levantine guest deities. One is the Nubian guest deities. And one is what you call the Netcheri, or the lesser deities of Egypt. First thing I'm going to ask is, if you had to pick two major deities of the Egyptian pantheon, historically, who are your favorite two?
That's hard.
Only two.
Oh, goodness. Ptah obviously has to be up there because he was the first deity that I ever knew anything about. I was introduced to him when I was about 5 years old and was absolutely fascinated by him ever since. The second one actually is a new interest, and something that I picked up as part of my research because I had to put him in the book, and I didn't really know a lot about him. And then by the time I had finished studying him, I had become very fascinated. And that would be the deified human named Antinous.
The lover.
And the last Egyptian god, because he was created in the 1st century.
That's Hadrian's lover?
Hadrian's lover, yeah. But I knew very little about him, and then learned quite a bit about ancient worship of him, as well as the contemporary traditions around him, which are very strong.
Well, I know nothing about Antinous the god, so what is it? What can you tell us about him?
Well, he becomes associated with Osiris from the traditional, because Hadrian has him deified.
Hmm.
He does not ask the Senate. He just does it himself.
Because he drowns quite close to the Abydos region, doesn't he? It's in that.
He drowned at. It's actually it's between Abydos and Hermopolis, and they built a city at that site, and so that's Antinopolis later. There was a Ramesside town there previously called Harware, but it was very small and it was already in ruins, and so they used some of the ruins to build into Antinopolis. But what actually was most interesting to me about Antinous was not his ancient worship, but was the renaissance of his contemporary worship, which actually started with Oscar Wilde and his contemporaries, who were trying to revive a kind of idea of a homosexual culture. And so then there was this whole, related to our previous conversation about things that you accept and things that make you uncomfortable. They were pushing back on the idea that there were not any, gay people in the Roman Empire, or that there were gay gods. And so this was a big deal for them that he was a gay god. And then a whole subculture took that and ran with it. And now there are temples of gay men worshiping Antinous as the god of gay men. And it is fascinating stuff. It's really interesting because it is absolutely in the spirit. Now, what Hadrian does is absolutely in the spirit of the Egyptian tradition, even though he comes at it from a different place. But what's being done contemporarily does too. It all sort of dovetails very nicely with what always went on, and it's just been reinterpreted into the current cultural idiom. And this is fascinating stuff. So
that is fascinating.
I need to know more about him at this point. I'm just like, this is really interesting stuff, and I want to know more things.
That is an interesting choice. The extent of my knowledge was that he died and Hadrian had him deified. Full stop. That's really interesting.
He's probably more popular now than he was, at least for a few hundred years. He was actually, Antinous had a very strong cult in the end of the Roman Empire.
All right.
And got picked up as an artistic. In the Renaissance, he was the perfect male form, and so then you have lots of statues of him that aren't necessarily religious statues, but they're callbacks to the religious tradition. It's very interesting because he transforms. He does a whole bunch of very different things for different people, but they're all of a type.
A real late bloomer of a deity.
Yeah, he would be the last one. If we count him as a full deity and not as a deified ancestor, he would be the newest or the youngest of the Egyptian deities.
Excellent.
So Dr. Siuda's favorite major deities are Ptah, the lord of artisans and the city of Memphis, and also Antinous, the lover of the Emperor Hadrian, who drowned in the Nile, was deified by the emperor, and enjoys a surprisingly long-lasting and modern cult. Now we'll talk about some minor deities. The microphones were a little bit muddy on this one, but Dr. Siuda's first choice was Horemakhet, or Horemakhet, which is the New Kingdom deity who is actually an avatar of the great Sphinx at Giza.
And out of the minor deities, or the guest deities, just lump them all together, sorry. If you had to pick two, who would you choose?
I'm trying to remember who I put in the book.
The minor deities include groups like Apep, the Sons of Horus, Horemakhet, the Sphinx, or Hamakis, the Sacred Bulls, Mehen, deities like that.
Yeah, I think Harmachis is fascinating. It's another one that was, started out as an object, literally a building, and then became deified and also got spliced with a Canaanite deity. Because there were people who lived in the neighborhood of the building who saw it and said, saw the Sphinx and said, oh, that's our god. Ended up syncretizing Harmachis with Haron.
I'm very tempted to go down a rabbit hole with you there, but I won't, because I'm also quite interested in the settlement of that area with Canaanites, which historically is referenced by late 18th dynasty rulers. But we'll put a pin in that because that could be another hour. Okay, so Hamakis, or Horemakhet, which is the New Kingdom veneration of the Sphinx. That's your first minor deity. Who's your second?
It has to be Medjed.
Medjed?
It has to be. I didn't even know who Medjed was until I did the book, and now I'm... How many gods have lasers coming out of their eyes? Come on.
Not enough.
Residents of the internet might already be familiar with Medjed, but just in case you don't haunt the same online hellscapes that the rest of us do, Medjed is an underworld deity who appears in the Book of the Dead now and again. He looks like a stereotypical cartoon ghost, in the sense that he seems to be covered in a white sheet with 2 eye holes cut for him to look out, and he genuinely looks, for all the world, like a character in a Scooby-Doo cartoon. Fascinatingly, Medjed has become something of a meme, especially in Japan, where he appears in manga, anime, and even video games. And in some incarnations, the god even shoots lasers out of his eyes. Truly, a deity for the internet age. Speaking of modern practices, one of the aspects of Dr. Siuda's book is an interesting discussion on how each deity might be approached or worshipped by modern practitioners of a revived Egyptian religion. Along with the descriptions of each deity's historical identity and role, Dr. Siuda also includes brief discussions about modern parallels and analogues. For example, a deity like Aset, the supreme mother figure by the Greek and Roman period, whose iconography was an undeniable influence on the imagery surrounding Maria, or Mother Mary, in many of the Abrahamic religions. As part of her Encyclopedia, Dr. Siuda includes a discussion about how these deities might be viewed, and, if you desire, how they might be worshipped in modern contexts. It's an interesting aspect, although admittedly slightly controversial for Egyptologists, who tend to shy away from modern revivals as less academic, quote-unquote, than the studied analysis of history. Let's explore.
So one thing I would like to ask you about, and we weren't intending to discuss it, to be perfectly honest, but it came up in the conversation, so I am going to ask you about this. One of the elements of this encyclopedia of deities that you provide is a modern interpretation or applicability for the worship of the ancient deities. You are, in your personal and professional life, involved in a, how would you term, revival or reconstruction form of ancient Egyptian polytheism. How would you define that?
I would call it a revival because reconstruction in my mind is like the Renaissance fair where you're trying to copy something, and we're not necessarily trying to copy it. We're trying to understand what it is about these deities that continues to live in the contemporary world. Mm-hmm. And we have no illusions that we are not and will never be ancient Egyptians, and therefore the religion, just like it changed in antiquity depending on who was worshiping, is doing so again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the book does include this component of modern revival studies of the ancient deities and how they might be worshipped by modern practitioners. Now, I will be completely honest that when I first received the request from your publisher about this book, I had a very gut, instinctive suspicion of that aspect.
Sure.
And I had to personally evaluate it and think about where that came from. And there is a tendency among Egyptology to view historical study of the ancient religion as legitimate. Anything that's in a museum, anything that's in a temple, anything that's in a book is a legitimate discussion of that. But then any attempt to practice it, to put it into modern meaning, modern context, is inherently viewed with suspicion. In your experience going through these, both in studying the ancient Egyptian deities and in practicing a revival form of the religious rituals yourself, the first question I will ask, and you can be as brief or as detailed as you want, is what kind of reaction do you get from academics on this aspect of your work?
It differs, depending on who I talk to and how I talk to them about it. Normally, my experience has been the same as yours, that it is normally viewed with some suspicion, sometimes outright ridicule, depending on how it's interpreted. Depending on whether or not someone has actually gotten to know me or they've just heard about me. Mm-hmm. I am aware that I am talked about by some people as being very strange. And it's like, okay, I'll own that this is different from normal practice. But I will also throw something out there to the effect of, why is it that you could have a Christian scholar, as in someone who studies Christianity, and many of them, throughout the history of Christian studies, have been actual clergy people. Not just Christians, but people who lead Christian practice, theologians, church fathers, things like that. Why is that desirable? And then the study of pharaonic religion, suddenly, if someone actually believed in those deities that they were studying, why does that make that suspect? What's the double standard about?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just something I would just sort of gently push back on that and say, okay, there's a double standard here, and why? And is that necessarily a valid double standard? Because I'm aware of it, and because I am cognizant that that's something that is cultural and that is way bigger than myself, I also make a point of keeping my religious studies and my religious practices separate. Almost entirely. This was the first book that I really tried to do both with. And I did it because after 30 years, I've just gotten tired of having to put my whole life in two boxes. It's just that, other people don't have to do it. Why should I have to do it? In theory, if we believe that people are religiously free to believe in what they want to believe in, it shouldn't matter whether I'm an atheist or a Christian or a Buddhist or I believe in ISIS. It shouldn't matter. Unless I was somehow perverting my scholarship to push an agenda, which I'm not, that wouldn't be scholarship anymore, and it would be a different thing. But the point of the book, I could have written this encyclopedia. You've seen it. I could have absolutely written it without that component, and I could have written it for an academic audience. And 20 people would have seen it, and there are already 10 of them. And we don't really need another Encyclopedia of Gods for scholars. We have them. We have good ones. But I feel like there is a place where we can talk simply about these deities and the impact that they have had on Egyptians and on other people across the world for millennia. And that to me is interesting. It doesn't have anything to do with what I personally believe. I'm just sort of fascinated by the idea that these beings, and I do believe that they're real beings, that they have had such an impact on people, that people continue to have something to do with them, even if they don't believe in them. Some of the things in the book I talk about popular culture, where Egyptian gods are appearing in books and movies and toys and things. Like, there's something about them that has great resonance to humans. Ancient Egypt in general has that going on, which is probably just because of its age. We're all kind of fascinated by early man and what early man was doing. And we see parallels in what they were doing with what we do now. Rightfully so. It was a very big place. It was a multicultural place. It had a great impact on world history. That's all very meaningful. But the religion in particular is something that, part of how I had gotten interested in the Egyptian religion at all when I was younger. I had been studying Egyptian history, and I learned about, and this was when I was an early teenager probably, and learned about Cleopatra and Mark Antony and what had happened to them, and it crossed my mind, well, what if they hadn't lost the Battle of Actium? What would have happened if Rome did not succeed? How would history have been different? And Egyptian religion in a lot of ways didn't stop because it was insufficient. It didn't stop because it was worthless. It stopped because it was stopped. Because it was made illegal and then it was replaced. In one point, Christianity was a better option, because if you were an ancient Egyptian and you believed that the afterlife was going to be just like your current life, and your current life was this terrible occupation of Rome and heavy taxation and awfulness, why would you want that? And then your Christian friend comes to you and says, oh, well, we've got a new heaven that's way better and doesn't have any Romans in it. You would sign up. That would make sense. So people initially are leaving pharaonic religions because they have found another religious practice that speaks to them, and in this case, that's Christianity. And then in the case of the Arab contras, they are being converted economically and by the point of the sword. They're being forced to convert, on pain of death, and then they're also being forced to convert because if they want a job, they have to learn Arabic, and if they want to learn Arabic, then they start to lose their own culture. And it's a gradual process. It's not instantaneous. Then we have this modern characterization that then just says that, exactly as you said earlier, it's all mythology. It doesn't mean anything. It's like, well, that's not really how these things happened. And even in European our European mythology. But I mean, even in European Christianity, there are things that come from previous practices that persist. Cultural practices persist. Culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. You don't murder an entire group of people and replace them with another. The world doesn't work that way. We would like it to. That would be nice and convenient for historical practices to feel that way, but history is messy.
All right, well, Dr. Siuda, that brings me to the end of my questions. So before we wrap it up, is there anything else you would like to bring up or discuss in the context of ancient Egyptian religions?
I feel like we covered an awful lot of ground. I almost feel like I need to apologize for all of that ground.
Nope,
but it's a gigantic subject, and it's also a gigantic book. So it's kind of hard to talk about the whole thing.
We embrace detail on this podcast, and I'm sure any long-term listener will be well aware we have just skimmed the surface of the surface of the surface.
Anything we talked about, we probably could have talked about for a week.
Yeah, absolutely. And for my listeners, I will put some links in the episode description so they can find your online material. Of course, I'll put a link to the Encyclopedia of Egyptian Deities for those who wish to buy it. One thing I am curious about is you mentioned in the introduction that this book was entirely crowdfunded as opposed to going through a traditional publishing house. What was the motivation for going that route? Was it a necessity, or was it kind of like a spontaneous thing of this sounded like a good idea, let's try it?
So it actually switched in the middle.
Okay.
I did a Kickstarter initially, and I had intended to self-publish like I had self-published the calendar book, because I did not want to remove the contemporary material to sell it to an academic publisher, and also because, like I had said, I feel like there are a number of existing dictionaries that are quite good, and we really didn't need another one in that vein. And I had also not intended for it to be a dictionary of this size at that time. When I did the Kickstarter, I pledged it as the idea of 100 essays, none of which would be more than 4 pages long, about 100 deities that I let the crowdfunding people pick. And
you went slightly over that.
We did. Well, we didn't start there, actually. Yep. So the Kickstarter happened in 2018, and it was successful. And so then I buckled down and started working on the book. And I was contacted a couple of months into that by an editor that I had done a previous book with, for Llewellyn, for the traditional publishing arm of things. And she had one of her other regular authors who had already signed a contract to put a book out. They were going to have a significant delay. But she had a hole in her calendar, which, in a regular publishing house, they're constantly publishing books, and so they've got a catalog coming out and they need to have X amount of books in it. And so this was kind of a problem. And so she had contacted all of the authors that she had ever worked with to say, I have an opening for somebody to stick a book in here if they'd like. And I wanted to let her know that I was interested in doing a book for her, but I didn't think that this particular book would be something they'd want, because it was more academic than not. And they're, it's not an academic publisher. It's a general public kind of publisher, and also not. And they publish a lot of occult topics. And so I didn't think they wanted. And I'd send her back an email to the effect of, I would love to do a book for you, but right now I'm working on this other book that I need to get finished first so that I can get it out to the Kickstarter. And she asked, oh, well, what are you writing about? And I told her, and she said, we might be interested in that. And I thought, no, you're not going to be interested in this. This is going to be too academic for you. But a month later, they came back to me and they said, we are interested in it. We're willing to have it peer reviewed. We're willing to publish it as is, even though it has a predominantly, it's like 75% academic. We're okay with that as long as it also has public appeal. And, and then I said, well, the Kickstarter had a special collector's edition that was going to be gilded and, slipcase and fancy stuff. And you don't want to do that. And they're like, actually, we're willing to write into the contract that we'll have it printed for you, and then you can sell it yourself, and it'll be separate of the other book. They worked with me the whole way.
Great.
I signed the contract in 2019, and then the pandemic hit. And so the book that was supposed to come out at the end of 2020 did not come out until this past April. Got delayed by 4 years. A couple of publishers went out, or a couple of printers went out of business. There was a big delay in shipping it from where it came from to get to the publisher. it was a bunch of delays that happened. But in any case, the book finally got done. But as a result of it going to a regular publisher, it got changed in format and became bigger. And I had planned for the private book I was going to do to be about 250 pages. They did a contract for 350 pages. When I sent the first draft to them for review to see if it was the kind of thing they still wanted, it was already at 500 and I wasn't finished. And so they said, okay, we need to talk about this. And I fully expected that they were going to come back and say, okay, you have to cut all the academic stuff. It's too much. But the letter that I got back was, we thought about it. We've decided that it would be an excellent reference material. And so we want you to just keep writing and see how big it gets. And then we'll stop when it stops.
Fair enough.
And it is just shy. I think it's 10 pages shy of 900 pages. It's long.
My digital copy is 8 pages.
It could have gotten bigger. But we decided that was big enough because the book itself is, 3.5 inches thick and weighs about 7 pounds. It's ridiculous. But yeah, so the book exists. It is for sale wherever books are sold. As it turns out, the deluxe edition, the collector's edition that we did, there are still approximately 20 copies of that left. And because they don't have ISBN numbers on them and it was just done privately for the Kickstarter, you have to get them from me.
Okay.
So if that's something, if people are really invested in having an art book, a really fancy version of it, that's available on my website. So until they're gone, and then they're gone forever. So,
looking back on it, are you satisfied with it? Do you want to do more?
Of course, anytime you write a book like that, as soon as you're finished, it's already out of date and you're already angry at it because you need to write more, but at some point you have to stop.
I experience that with every podcast episode.
You do. I mean, you just do. If you care about your craft at all, you're always improving. But I am very happy with it. I'm really delighted that they gave me the opportunity to do a book of that magnitude. And when I first gave them the draft, I was not at all sure it was going to work. But once we got the first design and they had laid it out and we'd seen what it was going to do, and we had seen the art, we got some really great artists to contribute. Traditional art, photographs of sites, and also contemporary devotional art. We got a bunch of different kinds of art. But once we saw that and we saw what it looked like, we were like, oh, this is really something. And it just came together very nicely. And I'm very, very happy with it. And the printers did a spectacular job.
So I was going to say, it's a very nice printing. It's very
nice printing. It's really good
colors.
Brown the edges so it won't wrinkle. It's just very nice. It's the nicest book I've ever done, definitely. And having gone with the regular publisher was good because there's no way if I had just done it with the amount of crowdfunding money that I would have been able to do a book of that quality. So not just the writing, but the actual quality of the book. It's much better than anything I could have done by myself. So I'm pretty happy with it. Where do I go from here? I don't know. I'm still kind of exhausted.
Fair enough.
It was a lot of work. That was also kind of the interesting process, not just the pandemic delaying it, but the process of putting together that book took a lot of time. But then having the information and the knowledge and the knowledge of where to go get the knowledge I didn't have took time. And it really felt like the culmination of a lot of years of work. It was in some ways it was harder to write than my dissertation.
Did you find that deities you started with that you wound up having to cycle back and sort of redo because you'd improved your processes so much?
Yes, several times, or in the process of studying, researching one deity, I'd find information about another one that I didn't know at the time I'd written that article because I didn't write it in order. There was occasionally quite a bit of that, and we actually had, I can't remember which one, but there was one deity that something fairly important about that deity came out right as they were getting ready to send it to the printers, and we stopped the printing and went and put it in. So there's some really lovely, very recent scholarship in there, which I was happy to do. And also I tried very hard to make an emphasis on indigenous and native Egyptian and Nubian scholars. Because there are a lot of them, the ones who are writing in English, the ones whose work is accessible. I tried really hard to get a lot of them into it as well, so that somebody could see it. I recently somebody had made a criticism on Instagram, well, she didn't talk to any Egyptians about this. I'm like, well, clearly you didn't open the book, because the first 5 people in the bibliography are all native Egyptians, all of them. Mm-hmm. So
that's Instagram for you.
I succeeded in the intention, to get a conversation about everything as broadly as I could around the deities themselves. Not so much the religion. I mean, it does come up, but it's more about the deities themselves, and about how they continue to exist in the world, in lots of different ways.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Siuda, I've kept you for an hour longer than I said I would, so my apologies. I hope it's not too late in the evening for you. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope in the future you'll consider coming back on the show to discuss all of the other deities at some point, or the later manifestations as well.
I'd be happy to talk about anything that sounded good.
Excellent.
I look forward to digging into your podcast myself.
Thank you. And yes, as I said earlier, for listeners who want to learn more about Dr. Siuda's work and the book, I'll put links in the episode description, so all of that will be available. So all I can say is thank you very much, Dr. Siuda, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week until we speak to you again.
Thank you.
My thanks to Dr. Siuda for joining us on the podcast to discuss these ancient and powerful beings. If you would like to purchase her book, The Complete Encyclopedia of Egyptian Deities, or any of her previous publications, you can find links in the episode description. For now, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you soon. Today's episode was brought to you ad-free, thanks to my supporters on patreon.com. These fine folks help keep the lights running and ensure that I can make offerings, primarily to my need for food and housing rather than specific deities. Nonetheless, it is thanks to the support of patrons that I am able to make the History of Egypt podcast my full-time job. Advertising, as annoying as it is, no longer pays the bills as it once did. And so, I would like to acknowledge the support of my patrons by making this episode ad-free for everybody. If you are hearing advertising, it is coming from whatever app or service you are using to access the podcast, and I am not receiving any benefit from that. Unfortunately, that is the price of doing business in the podcasting landscape. Many of the big distributors, Spotify, Google, Apple, and so forth, will insert their own advertising on shows, and the creators do not receive any benefit. It is what it is. They are providing the digital infrastructure to distribute these shows, and I'm fully aware that that is a price. I would like to clarify one thing for my listeners. On a normal episode of the History of Egypt podcast, I normally program just 2 advertisements, one at the start and one about halfway through. That provides some level of income which allows me to pay some bills, but I really don't want to overload the show with advertising experiences. If you are hearing more than 2 ads on a single episode, that is probably coming from the app or distributor you are using to access the show. Unfortunately, there's not much I or any creator can do about that. We don't have the power to dictate terms for Apple, Spotify, or Google, and until we do, they are going to keep doing that. I'm not complaining, it is what it is. But please know that if you're ever hearing more than 2 advertisements on a single episode, that is coming from somewhere else, and I am not receiving any benefit. Anyway, I would like to thank my patrons for supporting the show directly. They now provide the vast majority of my income, which allows me to devote more time to this podcast. Hopefully, that support continues, but if it ever ends for any reason, please know I am still grateful. To everyone listening to the show, thank you so much for joining me. Just playing the podcast on your particular app of choice does help me immensely. And if you are enjoying it, consider recommending the show to a friend. Word of mouth is always a great way to find new podcasts. Thank you for listening. I will see you soon.